Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third edition of the Hinrich-IMD Sustainable Trade Index launch. Every year, the Hinrich Foundation and IMD get together and we put out what we call the Sustainable Trade Index, which is essentially a ranking of 30 economies that goes from the United States to China to most of Asia Pacific, a large swathe of Latin America, Britain, and we rank them according to 72 indicators that are spread between economic, societal, and environmental pillars and see how they perform in terms of their ability to conduct trade in a sustainable way. The Hinrich Foundation is a philanthropy that is dedicated to the mission of advancing trade, global trade conducted in a sustainable way, by which we mean not the ESG version of sustainability, but sustainability in the form of societal and environmental and macroeconomic policies that can take us into the future for mutual benefit and toward the aspiration of trust between individuals, companies, governments, and nations around the world. So for the launch of the STI every year, we hold a panel like the one that we're holding today. And every year we touch on a different theme. This year, we are going to drill down and look at the subject of industrial policy versus economic resilience. Now, both terms have become the vogue recently. Industrial policy itself has vastly accelerated in the last 10 years. And you cannot get away from a reading of sustainable global trade these days without understanding these concepts. In the STI itself, we have indicators that drill down into these concepts, which includes tariffs, non-tariff barriers, investment freedom, country credit ratings, gross debt, R&D expenditures, and so on. So if you explore the index, you'll have a basic understanding of what industrial policy means. It essentially means a range of state policies ranging from subsidies to direct grants to free land, for example. And it's becoming increasingly relevant at a time when governments and companies are worrying about how to make their supply chains more resilient. Now, we have today a panel that is going to be structured this way. We're going to open with a presentation by one of my esteemed panelists, whom I'm going to introduce in a minute, Christos Cabolis, who is the chief economist for IMD, on what we found in the 2024 Hinrich-IMD Sustainable Trade Index, after which we are going to open up to a debate amongst the three panelists that we have today. And we're happy to take questions from the audience anytime, so please feel free to post them at any point. We will work them into our conversation. I want to introduce today the three panelists, very distinguished guests of mine on this panel today. Christos, I've already mentioned, is the chief economist at IMD for the World Competitiveness Center, and he rides a well-starred resume that includes he's taught at UC Santa Barbara before. I think it's Santa Barbara, isn't it? I'm never sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly. As well as the University of North Carolina's Kenneth Flagler Business School, where he was also the visiting associate professor for finance. He's also taught in Greece, and he's also taught at the International Center for Finance at Yale School of Management. We have also Simon Evenett. Simon is right now professor of geopolitics and strategy at IMD, but really is a lion in trade policy circles, and is aside from being the co-chair of the World Economic Forum Global Future Council on Trade and Investment, he is actually the author of a database of indicators from which the Sustainable Trade Index itself draws, the Global Trade Alert, and he's perhaps most well known for that. But aside from even that, he's well known for a range of other initiatives that include the Digital Policy Alert, He created the crux of capitalism, and he continues to be an avid contributor to LinkedIn, where his views on industrial policy is leading the debate. We have also Deborah Elms, who is head of trade policy at the Hinrich Foundation. Now, Dr. Elms herself rides a resume that is full of acronyms. She has served on the board of UNESCAP. She was an International Advisory Council for APCO. She was an International Technical Advisory Board of the Global Trade Professional Alliance. She has been on the board and, director of the Asian Business Trade Association. And she was, of course, most people know this, the founder of the Asian Trade Center. And we're very pleased that she's been with us for a year. And I'm very pleased to welcome three of you, Christos, Debbie, and Simon. Christos, I'm going to hand over to you now to take us through what we found in this year's STI.
Thank you very much, Chuin Wei. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where each one of you is right now. We are delighted to go through and launch the 2024 Sustainable Trade Index. And I'm also personally extremely happy to be in the company of such great and accomplished people who I'm looking forward to learn about a number of things that we will discuss. But before we do that, as Chuin Wei said, let's discuss let's put a little bit more information in what very nicely Chuin Wei said before. So what is the Sustainable Trade Index? What is the STI? So the STI studies 30 different economies and tries to understand how these economies balance economic growth, societal well-being, and environmental stewardship within the global trade system. And these economies, just to put some context and put the geographical image in your screen, basically are members of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And in addition to that, of course, we are including some major players of the region, the Asia and Oceania region, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. And we try to evaluate these economies by using 72 different criteria, which we allocate across 3 pillars. As Chuin Wei said before, economic pillar tries to evaluate how economies promote trade, how economies reduce the barriers that they have in order to do that, and how they diversify the trade partners, among many other things that we will discuss later on. The societal pillar actually assesses how different economies develop their human capital. How do they deal with issues of inequality? How do they deal with issues of healthcare and labor standards? And finally, the environmental pillar evaluates how the different economies actually take care of their natural resources. How do they manage both renewable and non-renewable resources? What do they do with respect to emissions, and how do they prevent pollution? So when we put the 72 criteria among the 3 pillars that you see in your screen, we came up with this particular ranking. And this ranking essentially shows how the different economies perform by performing very, very well in the 3 pillars. In the economic pillar, as you can imagine, countries that are very well versed in technological infrastructure, in innovation, in efficient trade policies are the ones that top this pillar. In the societal pillar, economies that actually work very hard on labor rights, political stability, and social mobility are the ones that we see at the top. And with the environmental pillar, essentially are the economies that show tremendous dedication in the global regulation and agreements that we see, as well as how they manage their emissions and the ecological footprint. And as you can see, at the top, we have New Zealand, United Kingdom, and Australia. Singapore and Japan fill the first five places. Why STI is particularly important? Because this is sometimes we go through rankings and we are not sure why we are looking for these rankings. And we feel very strongly that essentially there are two very important points here. The one is a direct relevance to public decision makers in order to evaluate what are the strengths and what are the areas for improvement of their own economy. And at the same time, the second thing is a call to explore how a particular economy fares in relation with other economies that may be similar in some ways, but also they may perform very well. So they get an idea of the best practices. We spoke before about the three pillars, and we had them differently in our screen. But if we take a step back and we think about it, we'll see that actually the pillars are, there is a tremendous interplay among them. And that's why we say that it is an extremely complex ranking. It's an extremely complex approach in order to find out what are the strategies that an economy will use depending on what the objectives are. So you see over there the three pillars, and in our mind, we have some criteria, for instance, workforce, education, and health, that in some respect, it is in the area that captures by all the three pillars. In what sense? Well, if you think about workforce, education, and health, obviously it improves the societal pillar. At the same time, the education part helps motivate the productivity, which is part of the economic pillar, and therefore we will see the productivity rising. And in many ways, the education part promotes our understanding of innovation related to the environmental pillar, and also the understanding of sustainable practices. So you see that by focusing in one particular area, education, for instance, it has a positive effect in all three pillars. The same can hold for something related to innovation and infrastructure, which is part of the economic pillar, yet it improves the societal well-being, which is the context of the societal pillar, and also addresses all the challenges that we face in the environmental pillar. There are other criteria that actually are shared between two of the pillars. For instance, air pollution, which of course a decrease in the air pollution improves the environmental pillar and at the same time improves the societal well-being. And by the same token, and this is very in the news nowadays, and we actually speak about diversification a lot. If we think about trade diversification, it improves, it decreases the risks in the economic pillar, and at the same time, it decreases the risk related to employment in these particular areas if one particular area of the economy actually suffers a shock. And then there are some additional very interesting criteria, like the environmental standards. And here what we know is that by improving the environmental standards, of course, the environmental pillar improves as well. However, improving the environmental standards imposes additional costs for the production of different goods and services, which implies that the economic pillar will have probably a negative effect, which implies and emphasizes the complexity of our ranking. We see a particular behavior that may improve the one pillar, while it may put at a disadvantage certain elements of the other pillar. If we place all these things together, essentially, we are identifying three different trends. And the very first trend is related to the workforce resilience, how the workforce can not only absorb disruptions, but also help to adapt in new realities. And this is a very important component. And as we saw, precisely because of the complexity that we have in the board, when we're speaking about resilience, we cannot think resilience over one particular aspect, like, for instance, societal pillar. But we have to actually place the concept of resilience in all the three different pillars. Resilience with respect to climate changes is something very important for our ranking, very important nowadays, the way that we see how transitioning, for instance, to green technology, to green energy, requires not only long foresight from the point of view of the business of the public decision makers, but also the business decision makers. But in addition to that, it requires a lot of leadership. And finally, we have the resilience in the economic pillar, which is what Chuin Wei discussed before. And in fact, what we show here is that we're going through a period with tremendous increase in different industrial policies. Very big players worldwide with respect to trade have instituted these policies. China, for instance, the dual circulation strategy, the European Union, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM, United States, the Inflation Reduction Act and the Chips and Science Act, India, that it is in our countries that we study, the production linked incentive. All these, in the end, essentially try to focus more in the domestic production and actually create more resilient supply chain. What is the outcome of that? As you can imagine, the outcome is an increase in different restrictions of trade. So the Global Trade Alert that our colleague here, Simon Evenett, is the founder of, has estimated that from January 23 to July 2024, there were about 4,000 trade disruptive policy introductions around the world. And if we concentrate in the 30 economies that we study, we found out that the tariff barriers increased in 2024 by 13% compared to 2023, and the non-tariff barriers increased by 23% compared to 2023. So, in our minds, the very important question is, can all these policies help in the end to create resilience and perform well in sustainable trade? Chuin Wei?
Thank you, Christos. And the subject before us today of this panel is whether industrial policy spurs or undermines national resilience. And the presentation that you just gave, Christos, touches on exactly this point, that the convergence between these three pillars, economics and societal and environmental, is apparent in the kind of policies that we're seeing today. You mentioned CBAM, IRA, PLI in India. I think Simon has done some research as well, which found that a lot of the predominantly cited motives for industrial policy these days is climate-related concerns, supply chain resilience, and geopolitical and national security concerns. So all of this is actually converging, which is why we chose this topic, because it is a very timely juncture, at which to think about whether we are headed in the right direction. Now, we're going to go deeper into this, but at this point, I just want to point to a poll that we're going to be putting out to our audiences right now that touch on the broader questions that Christos has addressed. And it's essentially asking you guys to, in the audience, to take your pick. What do you think? Where do you think industrial policy lies in the spectrum of policy responses that governments should be taking in this day and age, ranging from it being a legitimate way to give businesses the opportunity to succeed, or to it being really a very terrible gauge of how the market should work. I have a question to kick us off with, and it is a very basic question. And perhaps, Simon, you've done a heck of a lot of work on this topic, and I think you found, and I don't know if you updated this figure, but at the end of 2023, there were about 2,500 new industrial policy measures that have been taken, about more than 2/3 of which were trade distorting. And the advanced economies took the lion's share of this, and that's been accelerating since 2010. But the question that I want to ask is to just step back and ask you, do you think that governments around the world have learned the right lessons about industrial policy?
So thank you, Chuin Wei, for the question and also for the invitation to be on this webinar. As you indicate or imply, industrial policy isn't new. And so how have we learned from this in the past? I would say that there are 4 ways in which governments could raise their game going forward. But before I say that, before I explain that, I want to make one important preliminary point, that in addition to the many motives that you and Christos have highlighted for government policy, what we are not seeing is governments returning to producing and running firms themselves. What they're hoping to do is to attain these industrial policy objectives, typically through private sector markets. This means, and you'll hear me repeat variants on this, that essentially industrial policy has to be designed with the private sector's responses in mind. And this is where we start seeing big problems. As I said, there are 4 ways in which governments could raise their game based on experience. One is if a government doesn't like the private sector outcomes, maybe they don't think the supply chains are resilient enough, then they have to do a serious root cause analysis. They have to understand, why is it? Well, first they have to tell us what they understand by resilience, and then they would have to tell us why the supply chains are not resilient enough. Let's get to the cause. That type of root cause analysis, sadly, is not done very often. Second, the second problem is, once you've figured out what the problem is, the real root cause, then you have to tie the policy response to exactly that problem. At the moment, we have this implicit assumption that any problem can be fixed by subsidies, by corporate subsidies. And we have governments throwing money at problems on the assumption that this surely can't make the problem worse. Well, I'm not so sure about that at all, and I'm not sure experience shows that either. The third problem is that we have no idea often what success constitutes. So let's take resilient supply chains. How does one know that a supply chain is resilient? Until either it really comes under stress or not. So what are the actual targets that we're going to judge the success of a policy by? One of the things we found in our tracking of industrial policy in the new Industrial Policy Observatory is that governments rarely specify what outcomes they actually want to achieve. So we don't even know what the expected outcomes are. And so I fear that ex post, many governments will just declare success, even if the industrial policy outcomes have not actually come to pass. And the last point, the fourth area, and this really comes through in the histories of industrial policy, and this point is made by the advocates of industrial policy, not the critics, and that is, you need an exit mechanism. Governments need to be able to say, to firms or to an industry, we supported you, you tried, either you succeeded, in which case, great, go on and conquer world markets, but we, the government, are stepping back now. Or you say to the firms, you tried, it didn't work out, and so we're going to have to devote these scarce resources somewhere else in our society. And let's not forget, all of these resources and policymaker bandwidth has an opportunity cost, and that opportunity cost could be applied towards more directly targeting many of the measures which are in the Sustainable Trade Index. So I think these four lessons are the ones which I take from history, and I think that governments have a long way to go to get up to meeting them. And I think that's ultimately the lesson which we can draw from both the recent past and decades of experience.
Thank you. Thanks, Simon. And you've touched on this actually in a LinkedIn post that you put up this morning, where you referred to this quote by a German official that the subsidy bubble has popped. It was a great post and right on point. And I know that you're refining the points that you've just made in a draft, which really asks the question of policymakers: how do you judge the success of industrial policy, the success or failure? Because ultimately we are getting at the question of resilience. And I think Mike Froman was the one that pointed out that there are three costs to protectionism. One is the cost of the consumer, the second is the cost of retaliation, and the third is the cost of imitation. And it is that imitation that you are talking about here. The inability of governments and companies to sunset industrial policy. And this is something that Debbie has written about and talked about, learned anything from this. Debbie, what do you...
Thanks very much, Chuin Wei. I think there's some interesting lessons to be learned from industrial policy, and obviously here in Asia we have a long history. I'm sitting today in Japan. Normally I'm in Singapore. These are two economies that have tried various approaches to industrial policy, again depending on how we define it, and the net result has been quite mixed. In some areas, extraordinary success, and in some areas, obviously less success. I think one point that hasn't been raised yet that is relevant when you start thinking about industrial policy is not just what the policy itself achieved. It's been hinted at, but let me just say what was not done in the interim. So if we want to talk, for example, about building resilient supply chains for something like health products or healthcare products, so that if we have another pandemic, we're all in better shape, I think that's fantastic. I understand the initiative around this. But if you think about what that would look like, the government would then declare these are, for example, critical pharmaceutical products or critical health products, whatever those happen to be. We should potentially stockpile them. We should have manufacturing requirements that they need to be made domestically. We should have distribution agreements. We should have lots of different things as part of a resilient healthcare supply chain. And that's difficult to do. First, it's difficult, of course, to predict in advance what will be critical and what will not be critical. I'm not convinced myself that we would have put, for example, a disinfectant, hand washing disinfectant on a critical health product list before 2020. But obviously that became very important to all of us, as did face masks and ventilators and so forth. So I'm not sure you can identify in advance what would be a critical health product for a resilient supply chain. And then if you're creating some kind of resiliency in the system by requiring, again, stockpiling, distribution, et cetera, there are some challenges attached to that, particularly as Simon mentioned. If you want to do this for companies, then you need to think about, well, why would a company invest in stockpiling? Does the company need to pay for that? Does the government pay for stockpiling? Who's going to maintain those stockpiles? Particularly in health, those products have a shelf life. Is the government going to maintain that stockpile? If I'm a private company and I have things in that stockpile, I'm going to be very nervous about that because, among other things, what happens if the stock in the inventory expires and then ends up being used at some future point because the government didn't recognize that that was expired and there's a problem in health? That's my reputation now at stake from this stockpiling of products. The litany of challenges along the way, I think, continue. And the bottom line from all of this is that we do have to think very carefully about what is it that we would like to accomplish. How would we like to accomplish that? What are the objectives, as Simon has already mentioned? And then how do we get the outcome? But in overlaying all of this, in my view, is what are we not doing? While we are so busy, for example, stockpiling face masks and disinfectant, what are we not involved in? And so there are trade-offs that I think Christos mentioned in the Sustainable Trade Index that you can see playing out. But if you want, accompanying the index itself is a spreadsheet that allows you as the user to play with some of these issues. And I think it's really interesting to think about the trade-offs that are encapsulated in different parts of that database. If you had, imagine in your head, more here, you have less somewhere else, how do those sort of tensions play out? And I think for industrial policy and resilience in general, the big missing piece, in my view, is what are we not doing? While we focus on this area over here, there's something else that's not being captured. And one of the things that I particularly like about Christos's approach to the STI is some attempt to get your hands around those trade-offs and to reflect on what happens when you prioritize the economy over society or the society over the environment and so forth. And I think that's going to become increasingly important going forward for governments.
Yeah, absolutely right. And you focused a lot on medical, on healthcare products, and that is absolutely right. I mean, it's the most it's the clearest example of where the two butt up against each other. The desire for resilience versus an industrial policy that sort of willy-nilly just grows in and of itself. It feeds on itself. And there's some research done that actually shows that this sort of supply chain resilience, this sort of value chain resilience cited as a motive for industrial policy is actually the smallest piece. The largest piece actually relates to what they call strategic competitiveness. We're doing this because we want to be strategically competitive. The second is climate-related concerns. I think Christos has sort of mentioned CBAM earlier. And the third piece of it is national security, geopolitical concerns. I would argue that strategic competitiveness and national security, you should just combine them together. And they are by far the largest piece of the reasons that are cited for new industrial policy. So you're absolutely right. The resilience that you seek in healthcare, that you see in policy making today, you take that and you justify it by strategic competitiveness, and it magnifies like 100 times. I mean, that's just a loose figure. One of the issues that comes up when we talk about strategic competitiveness, increasingly these days related to industrial policy, is overcapacity. Electric vehicles has been a sort of poster child for this debate, but it has a much longer history, and it focuses a lot on China. Whether it begins with something as basic as steel and aluminium, whether industrial policy in fact encourages the kind of overcapacity that is damaging for markets in the long run. It's difficult to get away from looking at China in this part of the conversation. But do you see overcapacity as a rising risk in the global economy? Possibly as this sort of practice multiplies worldwide? I mean, Debbie, do you see that as a symptom?
I think it could be. I mean, I think that I am increasingly concerned about the use of the term overcapacity because, among other things, I'm not certain what is the difference between overcapacity and export-led or exports. In some cases, when I hear governments in particular complaining about overcapacity, I think, but isn't that the strategy of export-led growth that has been very successful over a long period of time? I mean, there's clearly some sort of tipping point between, sort of basic exports and then exporting partly because of subsidies and other issues. But I think, and this goes back to Simon's original point, because we are so vague about what it is that we're discussing, the definition of the thing, and we're so vague about what we expect to see in terms of its beginning, its middle, its end, definitions of success, and so forth. It's very easy, I think, to slide between labeling everything overcapacity. Everything becomes sort of dumping of products, and what we have traditionally talked about in the trade space of just exporting or exporting at a value, and so I think this definitional issue will sound to many listeners like a bunch of academics just complaining about semantics, but I think it really matters. We can't have policy based on unclear definitions of what it is we're trying to talk about. And then that leads us to have policy discussions that are also equally vague and nonsensical often, and doesn't really, again, to sort of tie this back together, address some of those trade-offs that are vital as you think about if you're going to support one area, then it means you are not doing something else. What is it that you're not doing? And perhaps that might ultimately be more important. And so before I hand it back to you, Chuin Wei, I would just say, one of the Simon does a lot of things that are amazing, but one thing that Simon has done that I think is particularly valuable is to focus in on this overcapacity question and to raise questions about it. Is this true? It's become a sort of, herd mentality stampede in that general direction. But, some basic like, whoa, before we all go crazy, let's just make it clear. What are we talking about? Those kinds of measurement issues, which again are sort of captured in the Sustainable Trade Index, I think is vital. You need to have the data, the facts on the ground before you can come up with policy solutions to a variety of problems. So let me just stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. And you know who else has taken a stab at this is Danny Roderick in a column that he wrote in Project Syndicate earlier this month. He makes this distinction, the Chinese government, again, sort of like pivoting back to look at China, where this is often used as a sort of benchmark, where he says that, when the Chinese government subsidizes R&D, that's sort of, what we think generally as being okay. It sort of relates back to the point where you were making, Debbie, about how we don't really sort of have very clear definitions about what's overcapacity, what's not. But in R&D, it's okay. But if they were to put in export restrictions on rare earths, that's not so okay. That's in fact completely illegal. So some are okay, some are not. Danny calls it the beggar thy neighbor test, and I think looking at China is interesting, because in China the real test of industrial policy is going on right now. I mean, there's a lot of structural weaknesses that are becoming more manifest in China, in the headline data that you see, and in the weaknesses that are showing up, in the unemployment, in the inability to reduce debt. Is that a consequence of industrial policy? Is that a consequence of overcapacity? Simon, I know that you've had some thoughts on Danny's column itself. What do you think?
I think when it comes to Chinese experience, one has to look sector by sector. We have had in the past episodes of excess capacity, which the Chinese government have identified and tried to do something about. So if you go sector by sector, you can probably make a strong case that for solar panels, there has been a dramatic scaling up of production, which is then found its way onto world markets. And for those countries, of course, which don't produce solar panels, they can now access solar panels much more cheaply. And this, of course, has positive potential benefits for the climate. And I think that's what Danny Roderick would argue is a good side of Chinese industrial policy. I think the critics would argue that essentially China has deliberately sort of planned this expansion. And I think that actually gives too much credit to Beijing. My understanding of the way that a lot of Chinese industrial policy works is that the provinces and the cities are given signals that sectors are favored, and then they go off and encourage all sorts of firms to enter and produce those goods. And at some point, many of those firms lose money and there's a shakeout and there's a rationalization process. And that rationalization process we're beginning to see in electric vehicles as well as in solar panels where the problems are. And the way that the Chinese orchestrate this is through the production licensing system that they have. And the Chinese have been denying production licenses to some producers of EVs and alike. So I think of Chinese industrial policy as essentially creating a tournament between the provinces and the cities for who can build the best firms. And then the Chinese allow a small number of those firms, which are profitable, to go forward, and the others get culled. And so in that sense, it's almost like organizing a literally, as I said, a tournament where anyone can show up. But don't think that just because you got into the tournament that you're going to survive 5 or 10 years. And that then leads to the process of withdrawal. I mean, there has to be a very disciplined process for withdrawing subsidies, and that's exactly the exit point that I mentioned earlier as the fourth of the big lessons. And this is where you can argue whether the Chinese should be stricter on this or not so strict. But that's how I think this plays out in practice. And I really want to stress this really is sector by sector. And I think that some of the sectors which we traditionally associate with excess capacity, such as steel, that's much less of a challenge this time around than the other sectors we've already mentioned. So again, one needs to go granular on this. And that is all to say, on top of everything I've just said, I 100% agree with Debbie's comments about it's hard to define what excess capacity is, and it's hard to differentiate it between export-led growth, which was, after all, the policy prescription we've given for developing countries for decades.
Right. Yeah. In fact, Debbie had last week, I think, or 2 weeks ago, mentioned in an internal discussion here, a Bloomberg article about truck chassis that manufactured in the US, which sort of illustrates that even before we get to the problem of overcapacity, we get to the problem of competitive capacity as a result of industrial policy. Debbie, I don't know if you want to share a little bit about what that was, because it relates to what I'm thinking about what Simon said and how that could be replicated, that issue could be replicated worldwide now as industrial policy is taken on by governments worldwide.
Yeah, this was a great piece by Bloomberg. I highly recommend that people look for it. That investigated the fate of 2 firms, basically, in developing the chassis, the body for trucks, trailer trucks in the U.S. And what was interesting there were many things that were interesting about this article. I'll just mention one, which is that the amount of effort that they both put into trying to get favorable policy landscape for their businesses was enormous. And the outcome was divergent. So they ended up being successful in some ways, certainly in getting policies that they thought would help them, but they were less successful in developing a robust competitive sector and an industry and thriving as firms. And it pointed again to, for me, partly the complexity around getting this right. So that even when you appear to do what makes sense in the industrial policy world of getting government working with private sector, identifying a set of goals, trying to achieve those sets of goals, there are other factors that need to be considered. And again, I go back to Christos's opening remarks about the trade-offs in these areas. So one of the challenges that they had to do with workforce development. Did you have the workers that you needed who were in the right location, who were able to deliver? Did you have the right environmental controls in place to be able to deliver these products at an environmental well? And I think it's the short answer of the sort of truck story, of the truck chassis story, is that getting industrial policy right is very, very difficult, even on a very micro level. So these are two firms making the same product in two specific locations. This is not economy-wide, this is not country-wide, this is not globally. This is just two companies in two locations. And even that is devilishly difficult to do. So for me, it was a great article for a variety of reasons, but one of them is just to highlight how hard it is to develop resilience in products or supply chains, because unless you've thought through all of the ways that these things come together, you can create a complete waste of money and resources, actually, and not have anything resilient at the end of it.
Yeah, it is a perfect microcosm, isn't it? There is a counterfactual, though. I mean, nowadays, essentially, you just you appear, at least we appear, to be unable to live without industrial policy as a fact of life going forward. It's just you see the justifications for it, and it's about strategic competitiveness for nations. All this is justified under the sort of banner of national survival. Some of it is actually quite right. A lot of it is justified under the need for climate goals, also quite right. This is in a way going to be an inextricable part of life. Christos, do you think that this is the counterfactual case, or am I off base here?
No, I agree with you, Chuin Wei. It is. I feel that nowadays, especially, what we see an alignment between industrial policies and resilience, and this started. Maybe the idea of resilience started really after the global financial issue in 2008, where economies all of a sudden realized that they have to make sure that they can come back. The issue, I think, that we have today, and this relies heavily, what I'm saying, in what Debbie and Simon already discussed, is that it is much more complex, because we have two additional experiences. One is related with a pandemic, and this brought a very complex idea of issues that we felt we knew before. For instance, inflation. Where all of a sudden inflation, that all of us were thinking that it is a demand-driven issue. Actually, supply side issues are very, very important. What Debbie said before about certain things related to the pandemic, that we realized that we needed much more at this particular moment. We didn't have any. And not only that, collaborations of the past broke down within a night. Countries that were very close with each other all of a sudden closed their borders. So we have this experience. And the second experience that we have, I think, is the increase of the geopolitical risk, which is something that affects all the decisions. So resilience comes in many ways as a way of addressing all these issues in order for different economies to be able to grow. Something that in many ways I realized that was in between the lines that what Debbie and Simon said is that, as with everything else, resilience is costly. And when we speak about resilience, it's not only standing up, it is actually a dynamic system that assumes adaptability, assumes learning of what is going on, and most importantly, assumes transformation, because you need to transform to the new reality. And these costs are related to flexibility, how flexible you are, and related to some redundancy. Debbie brought that up very eloquently with the ideas of all the medical devices that we needed during the pandemic. So in the end of the day, there is cost associated with that. We cannot speak about efficiency without taking into the idea of this particular cost. So I think I totally agree with all three of you that what is needed is clearly define certain terms that are used so differently around the globe, one, and secondly, clearly understanding what are the pros and the cons in order to be able to see whether you can have an optimizing position depending on the strategy that you will use.
Yeah. Thank you, Christos. Some people have made an attempt at, coming up with exactly this sort of taxonomy. And you're right, resilience is costly. For Huawei alone, I mean, it's a very conservative estimate. It was in the tens of billions that they have received, probably quite a bit more. But some people have sort of taxonomized it as being corporate subsidies are the largest component of industrial policy. Also, direct financial grants, state loans, state aid, and that's for advanced economies. For less advanced economies, they mainly rely on state loans, tax relief, capital and equity injections. That aside, has there been any example of industrial policy that you guys can think of in whatever form that you think is successful and that can help to refine this taxonomy? Simon.
I think that if I was to define different types or places where industrial policy might work or not, it goes really back to the root cause for why you think the private sector is underperforming. And perhaps the leading example of where you want a government to come in and to facilitate a scale up by the private sector came with the production of COVID vaccines. Because here we had a supply chain where along the supply chain, no one company would take the risk of expanding their production facilities and their sourcing arrangements unless everyone else along the supply chain was doing it. So this is what we call a classic coordination failure. And there you can probably make an argument. And I think one could defend the case that Operation Warp Speed and the UK equivalent of this were actually very successful examples of industrial policy. I would note, by the way, that the 4 tests that I gave you earlier were all passed in those cases, and that those industrial policy operations were not run by state officials. The person in charge of them were people brought in from the private sector who actually knew how to make a vaccine and what that involved, or at least they knew something about the biotech sector. So again, we can study cases. I think we can find cases. They're largely driven around, I would say, coordination failures. Many of the other reasons which have been given for industrial policy, like promoting competitiveness, resilience, these are words for which there are rarely very clear empirical targets that can go with them. So you don't know if the policy is actually working. Whereas in the case of vaccines, we know what we needed to do. We had to get stuff into people's arms. So the number of people inoculated was exactly the right metric. So again, I think the contrast between these examples highlights where industrial policy can be on stronger ground. One last point just on this is people should not confuse attacking industrial policy or being skeptical about industrial policy with being skeptical about private sector development policy. Maybe it's better to cast this whole discussion about how do we develop the private sector and economies in ways which are which are good for promoting innovation and productivity growth. And seen that way, then that widens the discussion to bring in a whole range of regulatory policies, and then you don't just focus on subsidies. And that might be a more constructive way of taking this forward.
Right. So the kind of policies matter. But coming back to your point about vaccines, I mean, that spoke to a clear and present danger.
Yep.
It was obvious what needed to be done. And in your case, you're talking about market failure. So the government steps in. It's absolutely clear what kind of industrial policy needed to happen. Is there, I mean, Christos, Debbie, I mean, are there any examples that come to mind? I mean, Christos, you've got something.
Yes. Simon used the concept of coordination, which essentially brings together more than one party in order to be able to coordinate. And we're discussing about a lot of problems, which problems are global, climate change. Yet, different governments in the fragmented world that we have right now, for all the reasons that we discussed, try to find solutions on their own. And maybe, looking towards collaboration, which may start by having few member groups collaborating, may provide something that will be beneficial for everybody. And what I have in mind is something that we were discussing in the past with Simon and with Debbie, this agreement of climate change, trade, and sustainability, which was signed a couple of months ago in the middle of the summer, among Costa Rica, Iceland, New Zealand, and Switzerland, where essentially what they try to do, they try to align the industrial policies that they have with respect to tariffs on different products with the objectives that they have with respect to environmental sustainability. And they have decided that among them, if the product is verified to be environmentally sensitive, and this is to be defined very carefully, then the countries will remove the tariffs in the trade of these products. So what do we have? We have a clear objective, which is sustainability. We have a clear situation, which is the industrial policies that they have all these countries assumed, which brings restrictions, as Simon has shown in the data. And at the same time, what they try to do is they try to align an economic efficiency part by removing the tariffs if they successfully complete certain pre-accepted criteria with respect to the environment.
That's really interesting. I hadn't realized that. Well, at least for environmental goods, they've tried to narrow it down that way. I mean, when you sort of expand it across the rest of all the goods out there, and in particular, these days you're dealing with modern trade products that are neither good nor service. I mean, in a way, data is neither good nor service. Is there a clean way to sort of cut it, sort of going forward? I mean, is this something that you guys have a thought or an insight to share on? I mean, I'm sort of riffing here, but it seems to me that perhaps what Costa Rica, Switzerland, and so on tried to do, I mean, are doing, and quite effectively, as you say, Christos, might not be so easy to do when it comes to the more nebulous sort of measures of strategic competition. Anyone have a view on that? Debbie?
Well, I would say we know it's not easy to do because we had an attempt within the World Trade Organization to create a list of environmental goods and reduce tariffs on those for climate reasons. And the entire thing literally fell over on bicycles, in which the members of the WTO had huge fights with one another over whether or not a bicycle was an environmental good. And there are still negotiators today who will respond viscerally with a sort of shudder if you mention the word bicycle, because they spent, literally hours and hours and hours arguing over bicycles. So I think it shows that even if we had a clear objective, we want to increase environmental sustainability, we want to encourage the trade of these sets of products, we want to clearly identify what they are, it's still very challenging because these are complicated issues. Coordination sounds great, and a smaller group might be able to coordinate. As soon as it gets bigger, it's very hard to coordinate with a large group of countries or individuals. And so even if we have, again, clearly defined problem, clearly defined set of issues we're working through, we know what the outcome looks like if we get it right, can still be hard to get there. And I think it's a bit of a challenge because, how do you get there is the giant question. And I think we've seen this in different areas. And one thing that I would say personally, we tend to have more success, I think, on some of these broader based issues. If you want to create competitiveness, if you want to create resilience, then instead of focusing on a specific sector, picking winners in a specific sector, I was just thinking that 20 years ago, I wrote a piece about the poverty of picking winners, and it's still true today, right? You say, this is the thing, we're going to be successful here. Sometimes you get it right, sometimes you get it horribly wrong, and you've spent a ton of money and effort in areas that fail. But one thing that does help is focusing on the broader based issues like education. If you've got a better educated workforce, which again goes back to the STI objectives to me, if we have a better educated workforce, if we have a sustainable environment in which people are not, succumbing to pollution, then we have a healthier population able to work. Those kinds of policies, although they're harder to pinpoint, can often make a big difference. And I think that for me, in some ways, is helpful for developing countries, because it's one thing to say you should subsidize your way out of a problem. That only works if you have enough money to subsidize. And even in some of the richest countries, that subsidy race or the subsidy war is ruinously expensive. So if you're a developing country, what do you do? Well, one of the things you can do is to focus instead on many of these more broad-based measures and try to improve that way. And I think, again, to focus in on the index, which is part of why we're here today, if you look at the ranking, clearly developed economies have an easier time leading the ranking than developing economies. But there is a mix, an interesting mix, especially in the middle, between developing economies that are actually fairly highly ranked and some countries that are richer that you might not expect to be quite so far down on the ranking. And for me, what does it do? It leads to questions about, well, why? What is it that they've gotten right? What is it that they've gotten wrong? And so pulling a bit more out of the index, I think, can lead to some interesting insights that aren't just applicable to the most advanced industrialized countries who have levers at their disposal that developing economies don't, but gets you closer to sort of, what is the right set of alignment for my set of circumstances, wherever you happen to be on the development scale.
Yeah, no, quite right. In fact, it sort of coincides with the question that's sort of come in, but it's somewhat incomplete from someone in our audience. Shadu, thank you very much for the question. Says he has a question regarding middle-income countries, but hasn't quite asked what the question is. I'm going to presume that he was asking the question that you've just unwittingly answered. It's absolutely valid, and also the one about the WTO, which brings us to another subject of whether the WTO is actually the forum where any of this can be resolved at all. But that's a completely different webinar, and we're already bumping up against time. So unless Shadu wants to complete his question, I'm going to ask all of you to, whether you have any final remarks. Oh, hang on. He's asking how countries like India should make their defense manufacturing policy keeping geopolitics in mind. Anyone want to take a stab at this? How should countries like India, make their defense manufacturing policy keeping geopolitics in mind?
I might just, I'm not going to answer the question about India and geopolitics, but I will say that many governments do use their defense policy as a mechanism for getting some of those policies more broadly into place. So procurement, innovation, R&D investment in technologies that may or may not have a military application is one of the tools that countries have historically used to achieve broader objectives. So it's not just about developing military capabilities, but often, again, the sort of research development, the education, the systems, the transportation systems, fill in the blank what, starts with a military application, but then ultimately has a broader consequence as well. And so that's another way that you can get in the direction of industrial policy historically.
Yes, and I suspect Simon would probably ask, define it in terms of, well, you have to define the market failure first. But Simon,
Well, no, I mean, I think in defense we are talking about non-economic objectives, which is you want to defend your country, and so I think there the goal is slightly different. I was going to challenge something else about the question, which is the question was originally posed about middle-income countries, and then the reference was made to India. I think our Indian friends have got to understand that they are now a very large economy, and their economy is going to be viewed, and their government choices and the spillovers created by those policies are going to be viewed as that of a large economy from going forward. And so they cannot use this small and medium-sized developing country argument going forward. They are a big player, and they will be welcome to the table as a big player, but they have to take on the responsibilities of a big player too. And I think I look forward to the day when that happens.
Well, I'm not going to encourage pushback from Shadu, but I wonder, Christos, if you have any sort of final remark that you want to make on whether industrial policy, does it hurt or help resilience?
No, I think it really, as a true economist, I will say it depends, and it depends on the issues that we were discussing the last 45 minutes. It is very important to know what exactly is the objective of the industrial policy. What does an economy try to accomplish by assuming a particular policy? This is very, very important, because then you have the capability of seeing the outcome and try to evaluate whether it was a success or not. It is not, of course, straightforward. It's not linear, because as both Debbie and Simon, and actually, as you said earlier, there are constant spillovers. And most of the times, there are spillovers that we have not been able to capture in advance when we originally tried to plan the industrial policy. So I think that we will move forward sometimes using the term industrial policy and resilience interchangeably, but I think we have to be very careful observers and very critical to understand what is behind these concepts and see whether in the end these actually promote the increase of the prosperity of the residents of a particular economy and the region, because in the end of the day, this is what we would like to see.
Right. Wise words from the architect of Sustainable Trade Index. I think we're just about bumping up against, actually we've exceeded time. And I just wanted to thank all of you, Simon, Christos, Debbie, for joining me today on this webinar, as well as everyone in the audience out there. I hope you've enjoyed this session. What's about to pop up on your screen now a bunch of QR codes that will allow you to download the various assets of the Sustainable Trade Index. As Debbie mentioned earlier, we have an interactive Excel, which is really the thing to explore to understand the STI more. We have infographics, we have country profiles, including the one on India. Thank you all for coming. It's a wrap from us today. We'll see you next year. Thank you.